Shalom Lukulam. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the Zoom. Those of you here in Israel and those in the United States and the UK and elsewhere. Thank you very much for joining us. As you know, those of you who've been on these before, we typically invite a guest on to discuss either some current event or something historical of note, or as is the case today, something that they've written which we think is worth discussing and delving into, and that will enlighten us more about something that many of us are thinking about. Our speaker today, Shany Mor, who I'll introduce a little more formally momentarily, wrote a really wonderful essay in Mosaic Magazine published on October 7th of this year. So on the anniversary of the day that all of us have been really haunted by. And I think it's one of the most thoughtful and thought-provoking pieces that I've read since then, because it is attempting to look at how we got there. And obviously that question is can be answered in a very, I think, in a very sort of simple, simplistic, shorthand way by just talking about the terrible failures, screw-ups, or even words that I'm not going to use on the Zoom for decisions that were made, mistakes that were made by both the political echelon, the security establishment, the intelligence establishment, and others. And hopefully at some point in the future, we will know more about all those things. But in the meantime, what I think is incredibly useful is to hear from intelligent, well-informed analysts about what underlying decisions, ideas, concepts could have got us to this place. And that's what Shany's piece does. His article was entitled "The Failed Concepts That Brought Israel to October 7th." So very much does what it says on the tin, as they say in my old country. And I'm going to speak to him for 30, 40 minutes and then put some of your questions to him. So as he's talking, you can write your questions in the chat. There's a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will select some of those to put to him. Okay, Shany Mor, Dr. Shany Mor is a lecturer in political theory at Reichman University. He's also taught political theory and international relations at Columbia, Brown, Haifa University, Sciences Po in Paris, ADA in Baku, and Oxford University, which is where he received his doctorate. His writings have appeared in multiple publications in the US and Israel and elsewhere, including the Wall Street Journal and Haaretz and Newsweek and Monde. He also served as a director for foreign policy on the Israeli National Security Council. Shany, it's a great pleasure to welcome you virtually to the Begin Center.
It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak with you.
Okay, so we're going to discuss your essay and the failed concepts that brought Israel to October 7th. You discuss, you suggest there are 4 of these concepts, and I'm going to ask you about each of them. The point you make right at the beginning is that there are, of course, the obvious failures of the intelligence services and security, and that's not what you're discussing. So it's important to put that out front, because I want to preempt any questions saying, why didn't he mention the security sector? Because I think it's a given that mistakes were made there, and that's not what this essay is about. Okay, let's get to these concepts. The first one relates very specifically to the ideas of and policy decisions and approach of the Prime Minister, of Benjamin Netanyahu. And obviously, as the Prime Minister on whose watch October 7th occurred, he can't escape some measure of the blame. People will obviously disagree to the extent of that measure, that's fine. But he's also, as you mentioned in the piece, been the dominant figure in Israeli politics for at least the 15 years since he returned to power in 2009, if arguably longer than that. And what you do, which I think is really, really different from much of the stuff that we've seen, which puts Benjamin Netanyahu front and center in this question of why this happened, is that you offer a very specific and I think nuanced analysis of his approach and his political orientation, and why that was so appealing to him and indeed to others for so long, and why ultimately it helped lead to October 7th. So can you take us through some of that?
Sure. You've given a better summary of it than I could. I think maybe the best way I can answer that is to answer or to state a little bit of what I'm not doing in the article and what I'm not doing in this section of the article. So as you said, I'm not looking at tactical and intelligence failures. They were obviously there. And when I say that I'm looking at conceptual failures or at cognitive vices or at systemic patterns of thinking, that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to look not just at the ministerial responsibility or the timing responsibility. So let's be clear about what I mean about that. If there wasn't a single conceptual failure connected to the person of the prime minister, he would still bear responsibility for this catastrophe happening on his watch. And that would be trivially true, almost uninterestingly true. It would be interesting for the sense of reconstructing the events, as it'll take us years to do, particularly on the night of or the months before or whatever. And that is an important intellectual exercise to have as well. And his responsibility would be enormous in that one. But I've left that aside and I've gone beyond that. I'm trying to look at a consistent, systematic mental pattern of processing events, making sense of them, and making political decisions that I think are connected to him. And the reason I set that first section up about him and his personality and his decision making is because ultimately, when I reach the end of that section, I say, okay, but this isn't enough. His personality doesn't tell me everything I need to know. And there's more to it. And that leads into the second section. And I'm not going to give it away too much. I'll only say that the discussion in Israel and to a certain extent outside of Israel, especially in kind of mostly pro-Israel or somewhat pro-Israel circles in the English-speaking world, really focuses on him and less on the things that come up in the second section, which I think is a bit surprising. And then later in the third section, I explain why it's surprising. But again, I'm jumping ahead. Let's take a look at Mr. Netanyahu. I say that if I'm going to oversimplify his basic normative commitment in terms of how he does politics comes down to three really crucial commitments to him: skepticism, deferral, and messaging. And those three things, as in any kind of vice, suited him really well until the day that they didn't. Skepticism is obviously very central, right? He does not trust Israel's enemies. He doesn't really trust Israel's friends. He doesn't really trust other Israelis. He's not willing to take any risks that involve counting on anyone. This was always a part of his political approach. It became much more. I would back up and say something first, by the way, that for Netanyahu, his two sort of big political traumas are, number one, losing the election in 1999, and number two, winning the election in 2015. He's a pretty consistent political actor in how he does things over about half a century of public life at this point. And those are two discrete points where he changes, where he seems to be a bit shocked by what he's going through and very quickly learns what he thinks are the appropriate lessons and applies them from then on. So the skepticism only becomes worse after both of those two events. The second thing,
sorry, Shany, just to say also, one of the things that I think is clear in your piece as well is that the skepticism is he maintains the skepticism partly because it seems to be borne out by events, right?
Yes.
So his skepticism of Arafat, his skepticism of the Arab Spring, his skepticism of, I think you mentioned Erdogan, where he's being told by other people that these things are going to turn out well, and he
Yeah.
says no, 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 they're not, and he's proven right. So the skepticism is buttressed by the success of his skepticism, so to speak.
Yes, that's true of the other two things as well.
Hmm.
With the skepticism, though, in particular, which is much stronger with the other two, is having it work really fits into his own heroic self-image.
Right.
The picture he has of himself as a historical figure, not since he became prime minister, since he dreamed of becoming prime minister, since he was a young man, was the person who has the uncomfortable truth to tell everyone, who's not believed, who's not taken seriously, and then events prove him right.
Hmm.
He's obsessed with this character. It's the one he's always wanted to be. He reflects it back on historical events and retells them, often really inaccurately, in a way that either makes him that character or makes a historical figure that character as well. Um, and he loves that character. He's always wanted to be that character. He wants to be the person who is sneered at, dismissed, and who is proven right by events. So that's the skepticism. The second aspect is deferral. Deferral is a nice word for procrastination. Um, he does not want to make difficult decisions now. Unlike other people, I think, in his political camp, he understands just how severe Israel's dilemma is. He just doesn't think that there's anything good to be done from trying to fix it now. He thinks all the options are bad, and that the best thing you can do is wait out the storm. That's been true on big matters. That's been true on small matters. That's been true on Israel's biggest existential crisis in the last 56 years, 57 years rather, which is what do we do with the West Bank? It's true, by the way, of the issue that he sort of fashioned himself as the leader on, the Iran issue. Really, Israel came to a point somewhere between about 2010 and 2012 when it could conceivably have mounted an effective military action, and he didn't do it in the end. Um, it's true on small matters too. Wherever he can avoid making a decision, he will. Um, this isn't just a psychological flaw. This is actually an entire strategic outlook. It might have begun as a psychological flaw, but as you pointed out in your comment a second ago, there's been a lot of positive feedback for it.
Hmm.
Everything that he's experienced as a politician and that he's interpreted his experience as a politician has led him to believe deferral works. And the third aspect is messaging, and this is really, really key. Of course, Netanyahu comes of an age. You think about Israeli politics in English, outside of Israel, with a vast overestimation of the importance of hasbara and the importance of public diplomacy, at the expense of policymaking and strategy. And his own political experiences taught him, as he understood them, the importance of messaging, of PR, of sound bites. He, in particular, I think the lesson he took from his defeat in the 1999 election was domestically was that he faced an implacably hostile media, and he's made destroying that a life's mission. Um, you'll notice that all of the criminal cases that he's been indicted in ultimately come down to, in one way or another, I mean, this is a smart guy who we know that he likes the good life. We know that he likes not to pay for things. But somebody who likes to not pay for things doesn't end up committing crimes, allegedly, right? I mean, that's a weakness that people know how to control. What ties together the places where he may have slipped up, and we'll wait for his trial to end to know for sure, is that again, that he set aside his better judgment and did stupid things that were connected to his obsession for controlling or having some kind of revenge on local media. So these three things were how he understood politics, domestic and international, and they were how he conducted himself and his policymaking strategy vis-a-vis Gaza. And the Gaza, of course, is one front in the larger Palestinian problem. which is that over 15 years, through several tectonic shifts in the region and in global politics, through the Obama and then the Trump and then the Biden administration, through before the Arab Spring and after, through the various reincarnations of Turkey's role as a regional power. He has essentially deferred any big decision, not let himself get excited about any of the things, any of the supposed great opportunities on the horizon that Israel's allies in the US and in Europe were excited about, or many of Israel's more liberal commentators, opinion leaders, and security officials were excited about. And he focused everything on crafting a message that ultimately, no matter what, I mean, he believed even more than anyone else. And that's how he arrived there. Now, I'm not convinced that what I'm saying about him is particularly innovative or new. There's been a lot of focus about him and his decision making. I think that the part that's missing, and here I'll transition with your permission into the second section, unless there's still things you want to say, is that that's not enough. If we're just a question of the prime minister's personality flaws, we would have had an easy time identifying that, dealing with it, and he wouldn't still be here a year later. I think that we have to be cognizant of a huge ideological aspect of these three essential orientations that he has. And that's true not just leading up to October 7th, it's also in the conduct of the war. So you hear a very frequent criticism, particularly from Israelis in the center and on the left as well, who say, Netanyahu won't do this, won't pursue the war in a way that's consistent with Israel's interests because of his coalition pressures, because he's concerned about his coalition, because he wants to hold on to his majority. All of which is true, but then finish the thought, because a majority isn't just this weird, thing that exists in the ether. It's not that he has coalition partners who just want to make life miserable or don't, want to do things that are inimical to Israel's interests, full stop, and he has to take them into account. He loses his majority if he crosses a particular ideological interest group, which is the interest group of the West Bank settler movement. And most of his flaws and most of the way they are expressed in policy are in consistently putting the ideological purpose, the worldview of the West Bank settler movement, which at its best represents somewhere between 5 and 10% of Israeli public opinion, of putting that over what are the obvious strategic interests of the state of Israel.
I just want to clarify something, Shany. So you're in your essay, you're very specific about who you're talking about here, because when you talk about the what you call the right-wing religious settler Zionism, you're not talking about everyone who defines themselves as right-wing. You're not talking about everyone who defines themselves as religious Zionist. You're not even talking about everyone who lives beyond the green line. It's a specific ideological group that prioritize settlement above other strategic concerns, and that am I right? Is that
right? I'm not talking about people. That's the thing. I'm talking about a very particular ideology. I'm not talking about
right.
sexual interest, but it's very important. I mean, all the things you said, I'm not talking about are shrinking it. So I want to make sure we also say what it's not in the other direction. I'm not talking about bad weeds or just hilltop youth or behaving or criminals or things like that. I'm talking about a comprehensive a doctrine, a comprehensive worldview that is in every way a reformulation of what Zionism is, a reformulation of what the state of Israel is, a reformulation of what the concept of a Jewish state is, and in many ways a reformulation of what Judaism is itself. And one that has over decades affected a partial institutional capture of many crucial state institutions, not a sectional interest. The obvious comparison that people make is to, let's say, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox community, which is a sectoral interest or a couple of overlapping sectoral interests that represents a minority that's able to leverage its political power to yield policy outcomes that are to its favor. Haredim are one example. There are many others. That's a normal thing in a complicated and diverse democracy. So this is something quite different. Um, and and in this case, what happens a lot in the Bibi years, but not just in the Bibi years, well before, and in fact, maybe in the Q&A period, we'll talk about this. I think some of the biggest examples of this happening are actually not under right-wing governments at all, is that in places where Israel has the possibility of pursuing what are its clear strategic interests regarding the conflict with the Palestinians, regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict, regarding regional interests, regarding our various strategic and economic interests in the globe, these are self-consciously put aside to subordinate it to a long-term strategy of not bringing Israel into the territories we conquered in 1967, but of essentially importing the special regime that we've constructed in the West Bank to eventually apply it to the whole country on both sides of the Green Line. That's the common thread running through many of the mistakes that we make leading up to October 7th, and in particular in the gross miscalculation that has us preserving and nurturing Hamas as a semi-sovereign, self-governing political entity separate from the rest of the Palestinian Authority, with full control over the Gaza Strip, with no possibility of reintegrating Gaza into the PA, and with no real horizon of a diplomatic process for in any way normalizing, even if in just a temporary or interim arrangement, the whole Israeli-Palestinian problem. That's done in order to give us another 10 years and another 10 years to keep settling, to keep taking over hilltops, to keep integrating the legal and social structure of the West Bank settler movement with Israel proper, with the hope being that that's eventually irreversible.
Can you, just to clarify or to sort of bring it back a little bit, when we're talking specifically about October 7th and what led to it in Gaza in particular, you raise the point, which I think many people here will be aware of, that Israel under Netanyahu had this arrangement with Qatar where Qatar were paying in suitcases of cash going from Qatar to Hamas, and you say this is like a perfect example of the problem, or a perfect illustration of the problem, because Netanyahu is both miscalculating what Hamas are going to do with the money and also miscalculating or underestimating Qatar. So it's he sees it as a positive because it not only maintains Hamas, which keeps it separate from the West Bank, which, as you've said, is in his interests, but also it strengthens another sort of plank of his grand plan, which is to strengthen ties between Israel and the Gulf states, and Qatar is one of the Gulf states. So is that...
I think the misreading even deeper than that. First of all, it's a misreading of Hamas. That's obvious. Yeah, it's a misreading of what Hamas is doing and what its goals are and how deterred it was and how scared it was after his operation in May of 2021, which was no different from the operations of his predecessors, which he decided for some reason was much more successful. It's a huge miscalculation of the regional dynamic in the Gulf, right? This was the illusion that the Israeli right had been selling itself for years. It was a huge miscalculation of the US and its interests, because the idea is, well, I mean, Qatar is totally dependent on the United States. They can say silly things about us on their propaganda network, but at the end of the day, a country whose entire security it depends on an American airbase can't possibly screw things up in any meaningful way for us. And if they did, there would be a price to pay. And it's a huge miscalculation of Israeli public opinion, by the way, too, which never really signs on to the Qatari cash, always sees it as a dirty deal. Even his most diehard supporters can't in real time, and certainly not after the 7th, find any way to defend it. But keeping that channel open, keeping Hamas afloat, is the only way to prevent a political process in the West Bank. Not one that necessarily would lead to two states, but even one that would, for example, just increase areas A and B, or lead to a settlement freeze, or even, by the way, just to part 2 of the roadmap, which doesn't call for a settlement freeze, but calls for the illegal outposts to be dismantled. Not even all of them, right? The outposts were from 1998 and from 2001, since it only actually addresses the wave of 2001. Part 2 of the roadmap, by the way, already opened up, for example, normalization agreements, all sorts of things that before the roadmap, Israel believed it could only achieve after a full peace with the Palestinians. Here, basically, a US-led initiative from the Bush administration was giving Israel things that it really wanted for years in exchange for just taking down outposts from 2001, which, of course, was never going to be allowed to happen, certainly not non-violently. And the two places that I think illustrate that, and that I think are key to understanding this story, well, the place that's key to understanding this story is just one, is Homish. So people remember the disengagement as the withdrawal from Gaza, but the disengagement did something else. It also withdrew from 4 settlements in the northern West Bank, which were all geographically located next to each other, and created an entire sector of the West Bank that was free of Israeli settlers, the area around Jenin. What we had was essentially almost a laboratory experiment for dealing with the territories, because you had one chunk of territory, Gaza, where you had no Israeli civilians and no IDF. You had another chunk of territory, which was the northern West Bank, the area around Jenin, where you had no Israeli civilians, but a full freedom of action for the IDF. And you had the rest of the West Bank, where you had both Israeli civilians and the IDF around. And for 15 years, between 2005 and 2020, the results were unequivocal. In the area around Jenin was by far the most peaceful and, by the way, the most prosperous area. There weren't attacks against Israeli civilians there because there weren't any, but there weren't attacks against there was very few attacks against the army, and very few attacks coming from there into Israel or other parts of the West Bank. In fact, during those 15 years, almost all the terrorist attacks came from mostly Hebron and occasionally East Jerusalem and the environs. And later, as we get closer to 2020, a bit of Nablus too, which not coincidentally is surrounded by also the most radical of the right-wing religious Zionist settlements. For the settler movement, this was something that we absolutely needed to hide from the public, lest any appropriate conclusions be drawn. And so there are attempts throughout to resettle this, and each time the army takes them down. In 2020, the policy changes. Changes when Benny Gantz becomes defense minister. There are lots of reasons why it changes in 2020. One of them is the pandemic. There was a lockdown. The money that was flowing from Arab communities in northern Israel to Jenin kind of comes to an end. There was many changes in how the army was doing things in the West Bank that were related to that. But the main thing was that Benny Gantz believed that he was going to be prime minister. He alone believed that he was going to be prime minister in a rotation agreement, and did not want to do anything that would turn the right or the settlers against him and give an incentive to sabotage that agreement from being carried out. And so he quietly stops doing it. And that's when the logic of the whole settlement enterprise kicks in, because people are there, they're not evacuated. Eventually there's violence. Violence from both sides, by the way. Somebody gets killed. When somebody gets killed, of course, the site where he gets killed is now consecrated. A yeshiva has to be built there. The yeshiva has to be guarded. If the yeshiva is going to be guarded, there has to be roads that are open to get there. If the roads are going to be open to get there, the army has to be there. Now there's more people there. People who are at the yeshiva have to live somewhere, so they have to have houses there as well. Next thing you know, you have a new settlement that's in Homish, which the leadership of the movement had been itching for 15 years. From 2020 onwards, what had been 15 very quiet years changes. And the number of terrorist attacks in the West Bank and in Israel originating from the West Bank starts going up and up and up. And for the first time in almost 2 decades, they're actually centered around Jenin and, of course, Nablus. So the place that was for 15 years the quietest in the West Bank, both in the region itself and in terms of the number of attacks that are originating there, becomes the worst, and it still is to this day, by the way. Um, and it's actually from 2020 that from the Israeli side the countdown to the next war kicks down. It's from about 2020, 2021 that the countdown on the Palestinian side to another war starts as well. I write about this a little bit in this article and in several other articles too. We can touch on that as well. But for me, at least, and in my writing, if you look for about 3 years, I was saying that, I mean, to me, it was obvious. I didn't know that October 7th would happen, but it was obvious that that there was going to be a real Palestinian attempt at some kind of violent explosion in the false belief that it was going to improve their diplomatic position.
Mm. Well,
Um,
that's a nice segue into the next section, because the next failed concept that you come to is sort of moves out to some extent outside of what's going on in the minds and the decisions of Israeli leaders, and more about more external. And the first of these there's these two concepts. The two next concepts both deal with this external actors, and the first deals with what you call the peace processes, which is a great term, who effectively support this idea of maintaining Hamas in Gaza, albeit for very different reasons than Netanyahu or the religious settlers. So who are the peace processes, and what's their failure here?
well, let's ask the question, with your permission, let's ask the question a bit differently, which is, we started by talking about Netanyahu and his flaws and whatever, and people talk about that a lot, although he's still around. So clearly it hasn't, he hasn't been convicted in the court of public opinion in any way by this. We mentioned the ideological aspect, and that would seem, if my argument is right, that would seem to be, just an easy political victory for the center and the left. At least the sort of moderate left. This is like handing them a gift. And you say to yourself, why aren't they pursuing this? Forget domestically. All the sort of former Obama people and whatever, who are always tweeting and things like that. You would think that this would be a freebie for them, that they would be making this case if it's not just the personality flaws of somebody they dislike, but it's a clear ideological aspect that's connected to far right and right wing religious Zionism. There should be a pretty simple case to make. So why aren't they making that case? And I thought about this for a while, and I realized that even though the ideological goals were all settler Zionism, the mechanics of the failed policies in Gaza specifically, I talked about the West Bank, but in Gaza specifically, all felt eerily familiar. They all reminded me of the mistakes that we made in the 1990s in the peace process. In fact, the language we used, the way we deluded ourselves to think that these were working, again, for totally different purposes, sounded eerily familiar. So we kind of convinced ourselves that Hamas was more interested in governance. They didn't want to lose power, that they had, their own ideas, long-term goals about replacing Israel. But essentially, now that they had a taste of what it's like to actually govern a piece of territory, they weren't going to just throw it away, that they were effectively deterred because we had given them something to lose, right? That's something we told ourselves all the times in the 90s, that Arafat now had an airport and had a control over territory. It wasn't going to just throw it away in some violent rebellion. That their rhetoric didn't mean anything, that was for domestic consumption only, that we didn't need to take it seriously, that eliminationist talk was just bluster or maybe poor translation, and that there was something unsophisticated. This is something that especially liberal Jews do to other Jews. There's something just a bit unsophisticated and unworldly about the way you take these things seriously, that you think all these people who talk about wanting to kill us actually mean it. And there were even minor hits that repeated themselves. For example, the idea that Hamas had changed its charter. I don't know if you remember this big bubble in 2017. There was a story about how Hamas had changed it. By the way, Hamas didn't change its charter, and even if it had, it didn't mean anything. But anybody who was alive in the late 1990s remembers this one too, about the PLO. There was another minor hit, which was that Hamas's dependence on a pro-American regional power, an Arab state, meant that no matter how bad its intentions were, it was restrained, right? I mean, and we thought the same about Arafat and especially Mubarak's Egypt, and to a certain extent Jordan as well. And and of course, the biggest delusion of all that especially Israeli liberals like to tell themselves, which is even if we're wrong, in the unlikely case that we're wrong, and something really bad happens, the whole world will see that we were the good guys and stand by us.
Yeah.
So none of these things happened, by the way. In fact, it all kind of unfolded in a very, eerily familiar way to the previous peace process or illusions. And I think that's a big part of the difficulty of why people who are identified with the center and the left, or with the sort of pro-Israel liberal voices in the US and abroad, haven't really been able to formulate the critique that I suggested in the first and especially the second section, because ultimately, what do they have to say there? All the goals may have been impure, and Netanyahu's goals may have been even more impure than the seller's goals in terms of his own legal problems. But the way of implementing it, if the goal was to keep the status quo in the West Bank frozen, which is not a goal I think that is a worthy one, but the way of implementing it in Gaza was entirely built in on the assumptions of what the Palestinian cause is, what the larger Arab anti-Israel cause is, and how those politics work, and how global politics work, that we've already shown are wrong.
Mm. Right. So there was, as with Netanyahu, but again for different reasons and manifesting in different ways, they also misread Hamas and misread the sort of the likelihood of this going, the direction of travel of this, right? They saw it as in a positive way, that Hamas was moderating, that they were sort of becoming a governing force rather than a terrorist organization or whatever. And of course we know how that turned out.
Right.
Okay, so let's move to the fourth concept, and I think in many ways it's the most interesting and the most original. You write about Gaza. You write the fact that a territory with all the fundamentals of economic success needs international assistance to keep its population afloat is a political choice made almost entirely by the international community through its various mechanisms of managing the Palestinian situation. And then you go on to say that actually maybe constitutional is a better word than political. And what do you mean by Gaza's constitution? And what does it have to do with the decisions made by international institutions? And also, then this is, I think, a really brilliant model that you bring here, that there are two other entities that share the same constitutional model as Gaza. So let's hear about that.
So whenever somebody talks about Gaza, not just in the last couple of years, but I mean, as long as I remember, and I'm not particularly young, they always mention that it's one of the most densely populated places on Earth, that most of its population are registered as refugees, and that it needs huge amounts of international aid just to get by. So these three things are basically true. But what's not mentioned is all three of those things are not facts of nature. They are entirely the creation of the international community and its institutions and its unique way of dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Hmm.
The refugee one is the most obvious one. Nobody in Gaza counts as refugee by an international definition.
Right.
The idea that a Palestinian living in Palestinian territory under a Palestinian government is a refugee is a deadly contrivance. It's an invention of UNRWA, which is one of the cruelest human experiments of post-1945 diplomacy. And it's densely populated because of that too. I mean, at every point in the history of the Gaza Strip, since an entity called the Gaza Strip came into being in 1949, its total fertility rate has been at least 50% higher than any neighboring Arab country. than Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon.
Wow.
It's gone down over the years as Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon has gone down, and still is more than 50% higher than those. That's because of the radically pro-natalist policies of UNRWA as well. And its subsistence on international aid is equally a contrivance. By the way, we should point out one other thing that's interesting about UNRWA and its effect is that Gaza and the West Bank have two of the most highly educated populations in the Arab world. So, I mean, you already had universal literacy among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, or something close to universal literacy in the 1950s and 60s, decades before that was the case anywhere else in the Arab world. And across any measure of educational achievement, university degrees, engineering, science, whatever, you're much higher there than you do anywhere else in
Because they were being governed by the international institutions rather than being governed by their own by corrupt despotisms like in like in the other Arab states.
For a whole lot of reasons, but mainly because of the enormous amount of money that's coming in there.
Right.
And you have a territory that can grow a huge amount of food and did grow a huge amount of food when there were still Jewish settlements there.
Right.
So there's nothing natural about the fact that a territory with such a highly educated population, with such fertile soil and a once flourishing agricultural sector should be so poor. That's not a fact of nature. That's a creation of this peculiar constitution that Gaza has. And what is this constitution? Well, on the one hand, you have something that looks like a sovereign state in the sense that it has a monopoly on armed force. But interestingly, it doesn't have many of the responsibilities of a sovereign state. It doesn't actually run the schools and the hospitals. UNRWA does that. It doesn't seek to grow food on its soil or trade with its neighbors to get food. It has international organizations bringing it in. It doesn't worry about public utilities because it gets electricity and sewage treatment and water from Israel. The things that would deter a normal armed force from just lobbing rockets at the neighboring countries' cities for 23 years, as Hamas has been doing since 2001. It's been shooting Qassam rockets before the disengagement, by the way, people forget. Would be things like, well, if I fire rockets at my neighbors, I won't be able to trade with them for food, and I might not be able to share their power grid. But that's not a consideration. If I pour all my resources into rockets and tunnels, I might not have enough to pay for hospitals and schools. Not a consideration.
Right.
There's something else, by the way, that's not a consideration. I mentioned in the article that a lot of Israelis like to make a big deal about our enemies' indifference to civilian casualties on their side. And sometimes that point is exaggerated for pretty obvious psychological reasons. But it's true that Hamas is willing to sacrifice a lot of its own civilians. That in and of itself is not hugely unique as far as despotic governments go in wartime. Lots of horrible regimes out there have not cared so much about losing a large number of civilians in a war. What's unique about the situation for Hamas and in different wars for Hezbollah and other enemies of Israel is that this is incentivized by the international community. Right. So whenever Israel's attacked in some way, there'll always be these boilerplate statements from foreign ministries around the world. Well, we understand Israel's right to defend itself, but it can't be something that harms civilians unduly or things they don't say for other countries, by the way, which has an enormous effect, by the way, on anti-Semitism in their own countries too, that they don't take into account and don't realize what they're doing. But that's a different subject. The thing that they're essentially saying is you, as an inferior fighting force, might have no way of winning a war against Israel unless you can get to a point where we can get images of your civilians dead. There's no other theater of conflict where that becomes an asset for you, where the international community is essentially incentivizing it, saying the advance of your enemy will be stopped the moment you can make enough of a spectacular human sacrifice.
Right. So it's not, so the uniqueness is, there's a great point. So the uniqueness is not that Hamas don't care or don't care very much about their civilian casualties. As you said, other regimes have done that in wartime. It's that they understand that it's actually in their interests for their own civilians to be killed. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, repeatedly, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's part of how they conducted their wars since 2007 with us, but it's particularly how they prepared for the war in 2009. There was something else, by the way, that was unique in this war, which was that in any other war where civilians are perceived to be in such great danger, the first thing that the international community wants to do is get the civilians out of there.
Right. Yeah.
This is the first war that I know of where rather than refugees welcome or let's get them out of there as quickly as possible, to say nothing of let's do what we can to end the war as quickly as possible, hasn't been on the agenda.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating.
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, and so I want to get I want because I want to leave time for questions, but
So I asked about the Constitution. So I asked where I said to myself,
yeah.
in the post 1945 world, where for better or worse, we assume that everything in the world is either water, Antarctica, or sovereign states. This feels unique because it's not Antarctica, it's not an ocean, and it's a very, very peculiar form of sovereignty. Um, and then I realized that there are nothing like this exists anywhere in the world. There are lots of anomalies in terms of statehood and sovereignty around the world. That's for sure. Yeah? Places that used to be colonies where there's still undue influence. There's many anomalies around the world. But something like this, where an armed force has the privileges of a police and a military, but an enemy state provides the public utilities, aid organizations feed the population rather than food being produced and traded, and the UN takes care of welfare and public health. That I couldn't find anything anywhere else in the world. And then I realized, oh, there's two other places where something similar to this exists, and not coincidentally, they're right on Israel's borders.
Hmm.
And one is, of course, the Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and the other is the Hezbollah state within a state in southern Lebanon. Now, these three things are not identical to each other. They're very different from each other in a lot of ways. And from the point of view from the Israeli security perspective, there's obviously a huge difference between the security cooperation we have from the PA in the West Bank and the fact that we're now fighting an open war with the other two. But the basic concept of a non-state militia that either is or was in the recent past an internationally proscribed terrorist organization, having a kind of armed semi-sovereignty over a territory without the responsibilities of sovereignty, and where its semi-sovereign privileges are enshrined in UN Security Council resolutions or international agreements, financed by major aid organizations, often, by the way, at the expense of other more acute crises. Yeah, I mean, for years, not in the current war where it's become much more difficult, but for years you had this phenomenon of aid organizations demanding to be allowed to go from Egypt into Gaza to bring aid. And I always thought this was weird in the 90s and the 2000s because Egypt is in every way a poorer country. So the Hezbollah one is fascinating because its role as a quasi-state within a state has been enshrined in one very crucial UN resolution, and before that in a written agreement in 96, and then before that in an informal arrangement in 1993, where again it's essentially has the rights of a sovereign army, none of the responsibilities of it, and as far as Israel is concerned, in all three cases, what our friends would tell us repeatedly is, oh, you have nothing to worry about. You're so much stronger than them. And you can always take care of it militarily if it ever actually becomes a problem. But this actually, I refer to in my article as the avocado model of deterrence, because what it actually was, empirically, in all three cases, was that And Israeli military action was always either not ripe, not ripe, not ripe, still not ripe, or way too late. I mean, they sent a suicide bomber from the West Bank. You're not going to go and reoccupy areas A now. But when we left those places, they said, at any time you could come back. You're not going to do that now over one suicide bombing. Definitely not over two. Definitely not over a way. And now that it's out of control and life as we know it can't continue anymore in Israel by about 2001, 2002, 9 years into the Arafat regime, if you go in there now, it'll be too costly for your army, too costly for civilian casualties there. It'll be a war that lasts forever. And same thing with Hezbollah and its rockets, and same thing with Gaza. At no point did we have any international legitimacy for doing what, in retrospect, we should have done immediately with the first rocket that was fired after we left in 2005. Because what, you're going to invade this territory because of a little primitive rocket, as we were told, a kind of firecracker? And once we actually were in warlike situations in 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, it was, well, you can't really go in now. Look, they're firmly embedded. They're everywhere. They're underground. They're in the tunnels. They're in the infrastructure. They're in the hospitals. They're in the schools. It'll be a bloodbath. Avocado deterrence is not deterrence. If it's always either not ripe or too late, then you're not actually able to do anything. And if you're not actually able to do anything, then the enemy you think or you're deterring is not deterred at all.
Okay. Shany, thank you very much for expanding on that. I do recommend that people find the piece on Mosaic and read it, because obviously in this longish but still too short time that we have, we can't get into everything. But I'm gonna go a little bit beyond the hour with your permission, Shany, because we have a bunch of questions. So there's a question from Svi Berg, who asks about whether you think UNRWA will survive the war in Gaza, or will they finally cease to exist? And this, of course, comes after the votes in the Knesset of a couple of weeks ago, which changed Israel's relationship with UNRWA significantly. So, what's your view of that?
I don't know what will happen, but I think that the Israeli effort to put UNRWA beyond the pale and make it difficult for it to function is the right thing to do.
Right. Yeah.
And there are moments on and off, particularly in the last 5-6 years, where we've had a bit of support from a few key countries, but repeatedly countries that have cut funding to UNRWA or said something ended up either restoring the funding or whatever. It's interesting, by the way, that some of the countries whose politicians have been really clear on UNRWA are often countries in Central Europe that have a history of waves of refugees and resettlement.
Interesting. Yeah, they have a different. They understand what a refugee really is. Yeah. Okay. So Danielle Danon asks a lot of questions on each thing. So I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll just ask a couple that I think are maybe interesting. So right at the end, she says, what are the lessons for policy in the future? What strategic shifts would you suggest for Israel to address these issues that you raise and to improve our security? What strategic shifts? Because a lot of what you said is about how strategy has been abandoned for all kinds of reasons, or the wrong strategy.
Our strategy has been completely abandoned since 1967 because our only big dilemma is one we've been terrified of. I mean, that there's the ability of Israel to construct a national security doctrine in its first 19 years and in the 57 years since are two completely different stories.
So let me put it a different way. If we had let's say a different government, or certainly a different prime minister, and one without the influence of the settler ideology that you referred to, what steps would they take? Do you think they should be taking to in some way address the mistakes that you wrote about?
I don't think that Israel has any long-term viability as a Muslim majority country or as a non-democratic country or as an illiberal democracy. Um, that means that if there is a possibility to consolidate the uh, astonishing achievement of 1948 on something like 80% of the mandatory territory with something like an 80% Jewish majority, um, that's something we should be grabbing with both hands. Um, that doesn't mean that um, that doesn't mean that we're putting ourselves in any real automatic security danger. Um, to the extent that our security needs dictate maintaining some kind of occupation, which I think they do in the near future and probably in the medium term, we should keep that. But there's a massive conceptual difference between um, an occupation and a civilian settlement enterprise in an occupied territory.
Right. Hence your example of Chumash.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Um, uh, so I think that's absolutely crucial. I think we need to be very firm on a few principles in terms of the international involvement, and particularly the involvement of countries that are very close to us and allied with us in any future diplomatic moves. The first one regards territory, and an absolutely firm principle that we must insist on from our allies and from the international community is any territory Israel cedes cannot become the basis for attacks against Israel. Ceded territory cannot be the basis for an attack on Israel. You want us to withdraw from southern Lebanon, parts of the West Bank, Gaza, whatever. That cannot be a place where Israel is attacked from. Not by suicide bombers, not by rocket attacks, not by anything. If there is a situation where we are going to withdraw from territory, I don't see that happening in the immediate term. Probably it'll happen actually, of course, in Gaza if we get to a ceasefire there, but not anywhere else. But if there is any situation where we do, actually, I take that back. Probably also happen in southern Lebanon if we get to an agreement there too. Any piece of land that we leave cannot be a place we're attacked from. And if we are attacked from there, we have to have an automatic right to go back in. That's the first principle. The second principle regarding development and aid, which is that aid for developing Palestine needs to be aid for developing the Palestinians, not aid for destroying Israel. Aid that goes to UNRWA is not aid that develops a possible future Palestinian state or any other kind of entity that you might want. It's aid for entrenching the conflict further. There's no reason for that money to be going in, not in that way. For a long time, we looked the other way because we thought that it solved a bunch of short-term concerns for us, particularly humanitarian ones. But I think the price was way too high. And the third principle regards normalization, or what I call abnormalization. And that's a much longer talk that, again, I think is important for Israel, but also important particularly for countries that see themselves as allied with Israel. There's an enormous tolerance that they have both in their regional dealings and at home for the abnormalization of Israel. And there was a huge tolerance for that among Israeli elites as well, who kind of thought that that wasn't really important. Um, and I think that has a big effect, by the way, on the problem of anti-Semitism domestically for many of these countries. But it has a huge effect, I think, on our regional security interests as well.
Um,
yeah.
okay. Okay, thank you. Let's go to another question. Shmuel Yerushalmi, he asked whether, according to you, does October 7th, or having October 7th mean that the Oslo process was a historical mistake?
That's a really good question. I don't know if the October 7th means that the Oslo process was a historical mistake. I don't even know if October 7th means that the disengagement was a historical mistake. I do think that the events from 1993 to 2000 raised some very serious questions about Oslo, much more than October 7th. The fact that Arafat came, never carried out the commitment to annul the charter, that the terrorism we thought was going to decline in 1993 by signing this agreement actually exploded very dramatically from 1994 onwards. The fact that we didn't get to a final status agreement and instead had a second intifada, and the fact that
despite trying.
And the fact that the peace process with the Palestinians, rather than opening the door to a full reconciliation with the Arab world, actually was concomitant with, really in so many ways, a real radicalization of views against Israel and against Jews, parts of which were connected to what actually happened, and parts of which were connected to other things like the advent of satellite television and other intellectual trends in the West. But that the things that Oslo was supposed to bring in the decade after didn't actually happen. I don't think Israel's blameless in that story at all. But yeah. I don't know if that was a complete. I know that was not a complete answer to your question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. There's a question here. I'm not sure how it fits exactly, but maybe just we can get your thoughts on it. Eric Passman asked what your thoughts are on the maritime agreement that Israel had with Lebanon. He says was supposed to bring peace between Israel and Lebanon. I'm not sure that's what it was supposed to do or not, but it hasn't. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'm very happy that he asked that question. I actually really like that question, and I think it's a really important one. So
thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. There is absolutely no reason for Israel to be if the Lebanese would like to have a normal maritime border with Israel, they are welcome to come and engage in a negotiation for peace treaty with Israel. That's it. I mean, the idea, the thing about the abnormalization of Israel is that it just assumed that you can break all of the normal diplomatic rules and still have the benefits. The lies we told ourselves about Arafat and about Hamas were we told ourselves about this maritime agreement. I'll never forget hearing, the reason I was so skeptical of the maritime agreement as it was happening was hearing again, you got to give them something to lose. They're not going to risk this cash cow of the natural gas, the whatever. And I said to myself, how many times am I going to hear this? It had all the fictions of the Arab-Israeli problem built in. So instead of two states negotiating a maritime border, of course, you can't do that because the Lebanese claim that there is no Israel, it doesn't exist. So it was all done through intermediaries. But then even there was a fiction because it wasn't really Lebanon we were negotiating with indirectly. It was Hezbollah, which is a militia, an internationally prescribed terrorist group. Why is a non-state with a larger army than an actual state's army the one that's negotiating the interests of that state? And why, if they aren't they at least sitting with us at a negotiating table the way normal states do, with a round table and two flags and some mediator in the middle? We have no territorial dispute with Lebanon. There's a big opportunity for Lebanon to develop its EEZ in a situation of peace. They're welcome to make peace with Israel. That should be the goal. And it's not very effective for Israelis to say that. I understand that. But what's really disappointing is that these international actors are so heavily invested in it, like the United States and France, and they don't. Even as an offering. Nobody thinks, by the way, that tomorrow there's going to be a Palestinian state or that Jerusalem is going to be divided. But they're always very, very keen to say that that's their goal. Nobody stops them and says, that's not realistic. You don't expect that. Well, of course, they know it's not realistic. But they see an importance in actually saying that. If somebody who wanted to push this maritime agreement said, and we are eager for the day when Lebanon and Israel sign a peace treaty that settles all border disputes and leads to normal relations between the two, just say that. Even if you know it's not going to happen tomorrow, make it clear that that's your goal, that that's actually what you think is the normal, legitimate thing to be happening. I think that would be helpful. Nobody bothered here. I was, how should we say, not surprised that giving them something to lose didn't mean that they would actually avoid a war.
Right. Because we're back to the peace processor narrative, the peace processor sort of dream world of how the Middle East is supposed to work, but
Not
actually
just that, we're also back to the unique international constitutional arrangements that we have on Israel's borders that don't
right,
exist
right,
anywhere else.
right. Okay, Shany, thank you very much for joining us and for going through this with us. Thank you for writing it and actually for all the things you write that I read, and whether I agree with them or don't agree with them or agree with part of it, I always learn something and it always makes me think. And I always invariably post it on social media and say, everyone, you have to read this because it's gonna get you thinking. So I thank you for that, and it's a great pleasure to bring you on. I encourage everyone to read the essay and to read other things that Shany has written. Thank you all for coming. We have our next event is another Zoom in a few weeks' time, December 3rd, I think. I'll send it in an email to those who are on my mailing list. That'll be a conversation that I'm going to have with Elliot Abrams, a veteran American official, State Department Department official, worked in the Bush administration and the last Trump administration, and he's going to be talking about what the incoming Trump administration will mean for Israel and the Middle East. So please join me for that. Thank you, everyone, and good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, and bye-bye.
Thank you.